Welcome students. Today we will discuss some basic features of the homeostasis. Actually, in the plant ecology and phytogeographic paper of semester 4, you have to understand this basic mechanism. Actually, this is a tendency of the biological system to resist change and try to remain in a state of equilibrium. All biological organisms, the ecological system, they always try to maintain this balance. Actually, in this portion, we are discussing the ecological attributes. So we have to consider the ecosystem as a whole. All ecosystems, they have a specific structure which are comprised of various types of living, non-living organisms. They form a specific, particular pattern, and obviously they try to maintain a balance. And in this interactive behavior with various abiotic components and biotic components, the ecosystem performs the function of energy flow and material cycle. And we all know that the energy flow, the pattern and the nature of the energy flow is unidirectional, but they may be multi-channeled. And every ecosystem can operate within a range of conditions, depending upon its homeostasis. And in this process, they have to follow some control mechanisms. And these control mechanisms, whenever we try to study, we can correlate them with cybernetics. The term cybernetics, actually it's a transdisciplinary approach for exploiting regulatory systems. Norbert Wiener first time defined the cybernetics as a scientific study of control systems and communication in animal and in machine. Now, we have to understand this graph very critically and clearly to know the basic features of various types of control mechanisms and the feedbacks. So, why we use various types of feedbacks and how they act together? Usually there are two types of feedback. One is positive feedback and the second one is a negative feedback. Now, how they are interacting with each other. The positive feedback accelerates a deviation and is, of course, in some cases, they are very much needed for the growth and survival of the organisms. But up to a certain limit. Beyond that limit, they create a disturbance. On the contrary, the negative feedback, which counteracts the deviating input of the positive feedback to maintain a balance. Now in this graph, the x-axis indicating the stress conditions and the y-axis indicating the ecosystem functions. This dotted line portion, this is known as the homeostatic plateau. This is the upper limit of the homeostatic plateau, This is the lower limit of the homeostatic plate. Whenever a stress or various positive feedback mechanisms are operating, they are controlled by various negative feedback loops, but within this limit. Above this limit, they create death, destruction, or collapse of the system. So each and every ecosystem or any biological system, they always try to maintain the balance or the homeostasis by these two feedback mechanisms. Now, within a homeostatic plateau, already I mentioned, the ecosystem has a potential to trigger certain feedback mechanisms. These are positive and negative. And the deviating causal feedback is known as positive feedback, and the deviation counteracting feedback is known as negative feedback. The negative feedback loop helps in maintaining the ecological balance of the system, and a balanced ecosystem has basic biotic components which have evolved with time to suit the environmental conditions, like the flow of energy and the cycling of nutrients take place in a definite pattern in that ecosystem, obviously under a set of physical environment. Now, as the outside disturbances or stresses increased beyond certain limit, as I already mentioned in that graph, that is, beyond this upper limit, then the balance of the ecosystem is disrupted. This is because now another type of feedback known as the start operating, and this feedback are called positive feedback mechanisms, which further increase the disturbance caused by the external stress and thus take ecosystem away from its optimal conditions. So, in one hand, deviation accelerating mechanisms are act by the positive feedback, and the deviation counteracting feedback mechanism or the negative feedback may minimize, may reduce, or may balance the changes or the former effects to transform it into the previous or the former state. Now, in this system, we have to use some other control mechanisms which are very much related with stability systems. Basically, there are two types: resistance stability and resilience stability. Resistance stability indicates the ability of an ecosystem to resist disturbances and to maintain its structure and function intact. That is, by this property, any system can resist, can protect, and try to withstand the stress and act in such a way that it can minimize or resist the various external pressures, but up to a certain limit. And resilient stability indicates the ability to recover when the system has been disrupted by a perturbation. That is, resilience, this quality helps in a system to recover much more easily than the other. So these two attribute, resistance and resilience, act together in the stability consideration of an ecosystem. Now, we have to understand the graph. This is a very clear representation from the book Fundamentals of Ecology by Odom. In this graph, the x-axis indicating the time and the y-axis indicating the ecosystem function. Now this is the perturbation or the disturbances or the stress or the environmental or other disturbing forces which act on the ecosystem. This is the normal operating range. Okay? And this is the measure of resistance. How we can measure? Just follow the caption. When a perturbation causes a major ecosystem function to deviate from its normal operating range, this is the normal operating range, the degree of deviation is a measure of relative resistance stability. How much it can resist. And if we consider the time, the degree of deviation is a measure of relative resistance stability, whereas the time required for recovery is a measure of relative resilience stability. So how much time it's taking to convert into its former state, this is known as resilience. How faster it can return to its former state, it has a much more resilience capacity. And this total portion, this portion is known as total stability, indicating this area. So, this graph indicating the nature of resistance and resilience to understand the homeostatic mechanism. In this case, again, I want to provide one of the very clear and prominent example of resistance and resilience. California redwood forest is quite resistant to fire. Why? Because it has a thick bark and various other adaptations to combat with the fire. But if it does burn, so beyond the limit of its controlling mechanism or resistance, if it burns, it will recover very slowly, or maybe there is a chance it will never recover. And in another case, California chaparral vegetation is very easily burned. So it has a very low resistance stability, but it can recover very quickly in a few years. So it has a high resilience stability. So in this way, various types of environmental condition and ecosystem act in a particular way to establish the homeostasis, and they always try to maintain a balance. Thank you.